In the last unit, we saw how Jesus sent the apostles out into the world to gather people into his kingdom as his people, as the church. We saw how the apostles did this by preaching Jesus, by asserting his lordship and forgiving sins, by baptizing people in the Holy Spirit and into his name and life. We heard how Jesus worked through this to unite people to himself and to each other in a new kind of community, the church, that was centered around his word and his sacraments, things like the Lord's Supper, gathered around him in prayer. And how Jesus kept extending this church and bringing more people in, moving it out from the Jews to the Gentiles, all the way to the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire and already across much of the known world. But what happened after the apostles started to die off and leave the churches without their personal authority and knowledge of Christ? That's what we're going to start looking at today as we explore how the church really had to start finding its feet as the situation these communities and churches lived in started to change. A good place to start working through that is by centering in on an event that profoundly shook the world of both Christians and Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70 AD. You remember, Jerusalem was the center of the apostles' mission. It's where Jesus first called them to go and spread the word, and it's where their mission started out and spilling out to the rest of the world from. And for a long time, Jerusalem remained the center of the Christian world and the Christian identity. For one thing, despite the fact that the Christians in Jerusalem were still persecuted and hated by a lot of the leaders of the Jewish people, Jerusalem still served as the base of operation for a lot of the apostles. And the apostles, understandably, carried a lot of weight and authority in the church. If people had questions, if big problems in the church arose, people would still go to the apostles and consult them for answers about how to resolve problems or disagreements, about how best to embody the Christian faith, about what Christ's death and resurrection meant for their life in the world. So the fact that the apostles were in Jerusalem meant people still looked to Jerusalem as kind of the base of operations for the entire church. But as time went on, the Roman Empire grew more and more hostile to the Christian faith, and many of the apostles were already being executed and martyred in the early and late 60s. As the apostles started to die, a lot of the centers of authority and identity for the Christians started to go right along with them. And this reached a climax when the armies of Rome marched on Jerusalem in the year 70 AD to crush a Jewish revolt and eventually burned down the city and the temple along with it. The apostles and Christians who remained in Jerusalem were scattered. And within a couple of decades, all of the apostles would have passed from this life. So how did the church manage to make do without the apostles' authority and without the kind of base of operations and center that Jerusalem served as? The answer to that actually goes back to the time when the apostles were still traveling around and preaching the good news and bringing people to Christian faith. Because as these communities kept springing up and congregations of Christians kept forming in more and more cities, four things started to emerge in virtually all of these communities that helped give them a sense of identity. In other words, that helped them be able to recognize themselves as truly Christian communities. And these four things also gave these various congregations a sense of unity with other Christian congregations spread out across the world. These four things were, first of all, their worship life, second of all, the scriptures, third of all, their creeds or confessions of faith in Jesus, and finally, their ministers, their pastors.
And we'll pick up talking about each of those four in our next video lesson.